that it was the lack of resolution of legitimate complaints and grievances around the conditions of confinement that led to the riot. And the recommendation was that there needed to be some mechanism put into place to provide independent oversight of the operations of the Correctional Service of Canada to bring transparency and accountability to the business of corrections in Canada. And that created the Office of the Correctional Investigator. That was 1973. The office was formed as a permanent commission of inquiry under the Inquiries Act with the promise that at the earliest opportunity, legislation would be drafted which would enshrine the office and give it statutory authority. Again, keeping with federal government tradition, that only took between 1973 and 1992. And in 1992, after what was called the Correctional Law Review, which was done to ensure that correctional law in Canada was consistent with the Charter, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act was proclaimed, and the office was finally enshrined in legislation. I tell you all that because it's very important to understand where the office came from and its primary function and what was expected of the office in terms of providing independent oversight to hold the system accountable for corrections practice in Canada. So, it is a small empire. The office currently has about 30 staff. Most of them are directly involved in day-to-day complaints. They will deal with about 20,000 contacts over our toll-free phone this year. They will have somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 interviews with offenders. Collectively, my staff will go to prison for about 400 days this year. They'll visit each of the 57 penitentiaries across the country. All the staff are located in Ottawa for lots of reasons. The primary one is to maintain our independence. We can't co-locate with anybody, not the parole board, not the correctional service, not the RCMP. We have to maintain our independence. So they travel a lot. We also move them around institutions. They don't stay in any one institution too long. We assign them to an institution for no more than about 2 years, so that there's always a fresh set of eyes coming in to see how things are going. As an ombudsman, I only have the power to make recommendations. I don't have enforcement power. So I can go, observe, and make a recommendation. That power is actually a pretty good power. It's not as good as the power that, well, the fellow that's now the head of corrections for the state of California, his name is Matthew Cape. And before Matt got that job, he was the independent agent responsible for prison oversight in California. It's called the Inspector of Prisons for California. And Matt is a lawyer and an ex-Marine. And he's a tall, square-jawed, good-looking guy, and he was actually asked personally by Governor Schwarzenegger. This is when I wish I could do an Arnie accent. He was asked by Governor Schwarzenegger to take on the role of being the Inspector General for Prisons in California. And he was given the authority not just to observe and make recommendations, he was given peace officer and special prosecutorial power. So he'd go into a prison, and if something wasn't right, he could actually charge somebody and then prosecute them. So it's a whole different model. In Canada, I have an ombudsman's authority, which is gives me golden key access. I or my staff under my authority can go anywhere, talk to anybody, see anything, read any document, gain access to any evidence that is related to an act or a decision of the Correctional Service of Canada in the administration of a sentence. And then I can make a recommendation if I think that policy or law or a fundamental lack of fairness has been discovered. And the Correctional Service is usually pretty good at dealing with our recommendations. Not only do we do complaint-driven stuff, we also, of course, do investigations on my own motion, which has led to a lot of our work dealing with preventing deaths in custody, dealing with self-harm issues, and mental health issues. We also have a couple of people whose job it is to determine whether or not force being used is reasonable. And I know that I've lost your attention, you're all looking at the slide. I moved ahead too quickly. But I do want to tell you that there are a couple of people in the office whose job it is to look at videotapes of about 1,000 use of force incidents a year, a planned use of force in a prison. So this is when the correctional authorities know that they're going to use force, like a cell extraction, if they have to move somebody involuntarily from one place in the institution to another. And they videotape each one of those incidents. And I have people who are trained in use of force and the law, and they watch those videos hour after hour after hour after hour after hour after hour after hour to see whether or not the force is proportionate and reasonable and necessary. And then we make recommendations around the use of force. And those are people who I'm very concerned about in terms of the violence that they are exposed to for hours and hours every day. Wait, this slide is just to begin now to move our discussion into actually what you came to hear about, which is the prevalence of mental health disorders, mental health issues in federal penitentiaries. So all I'm really trying to show you in this slide is that for all of these areas, psychotic disorders, anxiety, mood, whatever, the higher bar represents male offenders in federal corrections, and the bright red lower bar represents what you might find in the community. All I want you to see visually is a representation of how much more significant mental health issues are than they are in the community. And this is actually taken from a published study in 2001, which most observers believe significantly underestimates the numbers. So if we were to redo this study, I am told that we would probably see even a greater distinction between the prevalence inside prisons and what you might expect on the street. So we know a few things. Recently, the Correctional Service of Canada has actually begun to publish some better information. This actually comes out of a March 2010 study, and it was a report on the results of a new computerized assessment screening tool. And this is what they found, that nearly 40% of male offenders either reported or were assessed as showing symptoms associated with mental health. More than 3/4 reported concurrent disorder. In fact, it's generally accepted in corrections that about 80% of offenders will have a history of substance abuse or misuse, and about half of those will link their crime, their index offense, the offense for which they are currently serving a sentence, will link that with their substance abuse. And of course, we know about the comorbidity with substance abuse and mental health issues. For almost everything that I'm going to talk about in Canadian federal penitentiaries, you could say, and it's worse for Aboriginal offenders. So in this case, Aboriginal offenders are 5 times more likely than non-Aboriginal offenders to be categorized as alcoholic or a significant history of alcohol abuse. We also know that those offenders who are incarcerated with a significant history of alcohol abuse tend to be serving longer sentences for more violent crimes. So, why are we seeing the growth in the population inside penitentiaries? I don't have a great answer. I have some guesses. I was quoted in, I think it was the Toronto Star, actually misquoted. I didn't say it. I wish I had said that prisons are the new asylums because it's kind of catchy, but I didn't actually say it, but it was attributed to me. and so now I take credit for it. I'm sure I'm not the first person who said it, or certainly not the first person who thought it. But in fact, Canadian penitentiaries now house the largest psychiatric population in the country. And that's, I think that's a sad comment on two systems. But we'll get there later. So, is it because of deinstitutionalization, perhaps, as provinces moved away from large-scale psychiatric facilities? Is it because when the promise that those services that were going to be moved out of the hospital into the community, and communities were going to be helped to build capacity to deal, that is because that didn't happen in the way it was planned, those services are fragmented, perhaps? Is it because we've criminalized behaviors associated with untreated mental health issues or zero tolerance policies? I don't know whether this sounds familiar to any of you or not, but you know, I was given a talk in Winnipeg, and I talked about zero tolerance policies, and it was to a group of school board administrators, and they said, well, what is zero tolerance? Like what is that? I said, well, so here's an example out of one of the cases that I was dealing with, and it may or may not resonate with you. A fellow presents himself at the emergency room of a hospital, and he is in crisis, and he knows that he needs help. And he's gone to the emergency room of the hospital to get that help, but he's not very polite about it, and he's very anxious, and he's very loud. And when the triage nurse says, you know, there's a 7-hour wait, you know, you'll be called, go sit down. His response was to bang on the desk, smash his hand on the window, yell louder, and say, you don't understand, I need help and I want it now, I need it now. At which point, the triage nurse pressed the little button that calls the security folks, because the hospital has a zero tolerance policy for aggressive and abusive behavior. And of course, that triage nurse should not have to be subjected to abusive behavior. And so this fellow was considered to be abusive. So security folks came, he got aggressive, the police were called, he was taken to cells. On the way with the police, he got into a scuffle. He was eventually charged with assaulting a peace officer. He was already on probation. Can you see where this story is going? Again, I don't know whether that resonates with any of you. But, you know, have a talk with the hospital about their zero tolerance policy and how that may criminalize behaviors associated with illness as opposed to behaviors associated with criminal intent. So, we also don't know the extent to which this system is simply capturing people who are vulnerable because they're noticeable. If people's behavior is odd or noteworthy, that may come to the attention of the police, which may result in a negative interaction with the criminal justice system, which may then further fuel the folks that I see behind bars in Canadian penitentiaries. So,